Every morning at exactly 7:45, she walked through the glass doors of the office building. Her footsteps were soft, almost silent, as if she had learned long ago how to move through the world without drawing attention to herself. She carried a worn leather bag over her shoulder and a travel mug filled with black coffee. Her name was Renee, and for the past 3 years, she had worked as an administrative assistant at one of the most successful marketing firms in the city. The office was on the 14th floor. It was one of those modern spaces with open layouts, glass walls, and expensive furniture that was meant to look creative, but somehow felt cold. There were no private corners, no quiet spaces to hide. Everything was visible. Everyone could see everyone else. And yet, despite all that openness, Renee had somehow made herself invisible. She was 32 years old, though people often assumed she was younger because of how quietly she carried herself. She had dark hair that she usually kept pulled back in a low ponytail, and she wore simple clothes in neutral colors. Nothing flashy, nothing that demanded a second glance. That was the way she liked it. Her desk was tucked away near the back wall, next to a window that overlooked the parking lot. It wasn't a nice view, but she didn't mind. She had decorated the small space with only one personal item, a framed photograph of an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair. The woman in the photo was smiling, her hands resting on the keys of a piano. Most people who passed by the desk never noticed the picture, and those who did never asked about it. That was fine with Renee. She wasn't the type to share her story with just anyone. Her job was simple enough. She answered phones, scheduled meetings, organized files, and handled whatever random tasks the executives didn't want to deal with themselves. She was efficient and reliable. She never complained, never pushed back, never caused any trouble. In a company full of loud personalities and big egos, she was the one person who simply did her work and went home. Her coworkers barely knew anything about her. They knew she was quiet. They knew she always brought her own lunch instead of ordering with the group. They knew she left the office exactly at 5 o'clock every day, without staying for after-work drinks or gossip sessions. But beyond that, she was a mystery. Some of them assumed she was boring. Others thought she was shy. A few believed she was just antisocial. None of them ever considered that maybe, just maybe, there was something more beneath the surface. Something she had buried so deep that even she had almost forgotten it was there. The truth was, Renee had once lived a completely different life. Before the quiet desk and the filing cabinets and the endless emails, she had been a musician. Not just any musician, but a truly gifted one. By the age of 6, she could play piano pieces that most adults struggled with. By 12, she had won national competitions. By 17, she had performed on some of the most prestigious stages in the country. Critics had called her a prodigy. Teachers had said she had the kind of talent that comes along once in a generation. But life has a way of changing everything in an instant. When Renee was 19, her grandmother got sick. The same grandmother who had raised her since she was a baby. The same grandmother who had noticed her gift when she was just a toddler banging on toy keyboards. The same grandmother who had sacrificed everything to pay for her lessons, her training, her dreams. There was no one else. Renee's mother had left when she was only a few months old, and she had never known her father. Her grandmother was her whole world, so when the doctors said the illness would be long and difficult, Renee made a choice. She left her music program. She came home, and she spent the next 4 years taking care of the woman who had given her everything. Those years were hard. She worked odd jobs during the day and stayed up through the night when her grandmother couldn't sleep. She learned how to give medications and change bandages and cook soft foods that were easy to swallow. She learned how to be strong even when she felt like falling apart. And through it all, she stopped playing piano. At first, it was simply because she didn't have time. Then it was because she didn't have the energy. But eventually, it became something else. The piano reminded her of everything she had lost, everything she had given up. Every time she looked at the keys, she saw the life she could have had. It was too painful, so she closed the lid and walked away. Her grandmother passed away on a rainy Tuesday in October. Renee was 23 years old, alone in the world. with no degree, no career, and no idea what to do next. The grief was overwhelming. For months, she barely left the small apartment they had shared. She stopped answering calls. She stopped seeing friends. She simply existed, one empty day at a time. Eventually, she knew she had to do something. The money from her grandmother's savings wouldn't last forever, so she pulled herself together, bought a second-hand suit, and started applying for jobs. She didn't mention her musical background on her resume. She didn't talk about the competitions or the performances or the standing ovations. That part of her life was over. She needed to move on. The job at the marketing firm wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She found a small studio apartment a few blocks away. She developed a routine. Wake up, go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable. And after everything she had been through, stable felt like enough. Years passed, 3 of them, to be exact, and in all that time, not a single person at the office knew that the quiet woman who made copies and fetched coffee had once been called one of the most talented pianists of her generation. She never mentioned it. Why would she? That girl felt like a stranger now. Someone from another lifetime. But some things never truly disappear. No matter how hard you try to bury them, they stay with you. They hide in the corners of your heart, waiting, and sometimes, when she was alone in her apartment late at night, Renee would catch herself moving her fingers in the air, playing invisible keys, hearing music that existed only in her memory. She would stop herself every time. She would shake her head, take a deep breath, and remind herself that those days were gone. She had made her choice. She had no regrets. At least, that's what she told herself. At the office, nobody paid much attention to her. She was just part of the background, like the potted plants in the lobby or the hum of the air conditioning. People walked past her desk without saying hello. They forgot to invite her to birthday celebrations. They mispronounced her name in meetings, if they remembered her name at all. And the person who noticed her the least was the one who should have noticed her the most, the boss himself. He was a tall man, in his 50s, with gray hair and expensive suits. He had built the company from the ground up, and he never let anyone forget it. He walked through the office like he owned not just the business, but everyone in it. His voice was always loud. His opinions were always right. And his ego was bigger than the corner office he occupied. He barely knew Renee existed. To him, she was just another assistant. Someone to handle the small stuff. Someone who didn't matter. But that was all about to change. It was a Wednesday afternoon when everything started to shift. The kind of ordinary day that gives no warning about what's coming. Renee was at her desk, sorting through a stack of expense reports, when the email arrived. A company-wide meeting had been scheduled for 3 o'clock in the main conference room. Attendance was mandatory. She glanced at the clock. It was already 2:45. She saved her work, grabbed a notebook, and made her way down the hall with the rest of the staff. The conference room was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a long, polished table that could seat at least 30 people. By the time Renee arrived, most of the chairs were already taken. She found a spot near the back, close to the door, where she could listen without being noticed. The boss walked in exactly at 3. He was wearing one of his signature navy suits, and his silver watch caught the light. As he gestured for everyone to settle down, behind him came 2 members of the senior leadership team, both carrying tablets and looking important. He didn't waste time with small talk. That wasn't his style. As most of you know, he began, his voice filling the room like he was addressing a stadium. Our annual company gala is coming up in 3 weeks. This year, we're doing things differently. We've booked the Grand Lakeview Hotel. Black tie. 300 guests. This is going to be the biggest event in the company's history. ATM. 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 There were murmurs of excitement around the table. The annual gala was always a big deal. But this sounded even more extravagant than usual. People started whispering about what they would wear and who they might bring as their +1. The boss held up a hand to silence them. Now, here's the situation. The hotel has a beautiful grand piano in the main ballroom. I mean, this thing is stunning. It's the centerpiece of the room. So we need someone to play it. Background music. Something elegant. Something that fits the atmosphere. One of the senior managers spoke up. Should we hire a professional pianist? I can reach out to some agencies. The boss waved his hand dismissively. I already looked into it. The good ones are either booked or charging ridiculous fees. We're talking $5,000–6,000 for a few hours of playing. That's money we could spend on better things. He paused, scanning the room with a look that said he expected someone to solve his problem. So I'm asking you. Does anyone here play piano? Anyone at all? Even at a basic level. We just need someone who can keep a tune going while people mingle and eat their shrimp cocktails. The room went quiet. People exchanged awkward glances. A few shook their heads. Someone made a joke about only being able to play chopsticks, and a few people laughed nervously. Renee sat frozen in her chair. Her heart had started beating faster the moment he mentioned the piano. A grand piano. In a ballroom. For hundreds of guests. The thought stirred something deep inside her, something she had tried so hard to keep locked away. She told herself to stay quiet. This wasn't her moment. She wasn't that person anymore. She was just the administrative assistant who handled paperwork and stayed in the background. That's who she was now. But then she thought about her grandmother. She could almost hear her voice, soft and warm, the way it used to sound when Renee was a little girl sitting at the piano bench for the first time. You have a gift, her grandmother used to say. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that. Before she could stop herself, Renee raised her hand. It was a small movement. Hesitant. Her hand barely made it above her shoulder. But in the silence of that room, it might as well have been a firework. The boss turned his head slowly. His eyes landed on her, and for a moment, he seemed confused, like he was trying to remember who she was. You? He said, a slight frown forming on his face. You play piano? Renee's voice came out quieter than she intended. Yes. I used to play. I could help out if you need someone. A strange silence hung in the air. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers turning toward her. Some looked curious, others looked surprised. A few seemed almost amused, like they were waiting for the punchline of a joke. The boss let out a short laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made your stomach drop. Wait a minute, he said, taking a step closer to her end of the table. You're telling me that you, the girl who schedules my meetings and organizes my files, you play piano? Renee swallowed hard. Yes, I've had training. I could. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. Hold on. Hold on. Let me get this straight. He turned to the rest of the room, a smirk spreading across his face. She thinks she can play at our gala. The biggest event of the year. In front of 300 guests, including clients and investors. A few people chuckled nervously. Others stayed silent, unsure of where this was going. The boss shook his head slowly, like a teacher disappointed in a student who had given a ridiculous answer. Look, sweetheart. I appreciate the enthusiasm. I really do, but this isn't some casual little get-together. This is a high-class event. We need someone who actually knows what they're doing. Not someone who probably learned Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star at summer camp. The laughter came then, not from everyone, but enough. Enough to fill the room. Enough to make Renee's face burn with humiliation. She opened her mouth to say something, to explain, to tell him that she wasn't some amateur who plunked out nursery rhymes. She had performed at concert halls. She had won awards. She had once made audiences weep with nothing but her hands and 88 keys. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in her throat, blocked by years of silence and self-doubt and the weight of everything she had buried. The boss had already moved on. Anyway, let's keep looking. Maybe we can find a music student who won't charge an arm and a leg. Someone who actually has credentials. And just like that, Renee became invisible again. The meeting ended a few minutes later. People filed out of the conference room, chatting about the gala and making plans. Nobody looked at Renee. Nobody said anything to her. It was as if her moment of courage had already been forgotten. She walked back to her desk in a daze. Her hands were trembling slightly. She sat down in her chair and stared at the photograph of her grandmother. The kind eyes, the gentle smile, the piano keys beneath her fingertips. A tear slid down Renee's cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, hoping no one had seen. She felt foolish. Why had she even raised her hand? What had she expected? That the boss would suddenly see her differently? That he would recognize some hidden potential in the quiet woman who made copies and fetched coffee? Of course not. To him, she was nobody. Just another background character in his story. For the rest of the afternoon, Renee went through the motions. She answered calls. She filed documents. She smiled politely when people walked by. But inside, she was somewhere else. She was back in her grandmother's living room, sitting at the old upright piano, playing until her fingers ached and her heart felt full. That night, she went home to her small apartment and sat alone in the silence. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't make dinner. She just sat there, staring at the wall, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The laughter. The smirk. The way he had called her sweetheart. Like she was a child who didn't know any better. Something shifted inside her that night. It wasn't anger. Exactly. It was something quieter. Something deeper. A tiny spark that had been dormant for years, slowly beginning to glow. She didn't know it yet, but that spark was about to become a fire. The 3 weeks leading up to the gala passed slowly. Renee kept her head down and did her work, just like always. She didn't mention the meeting again. She didn't bring up the piano. She acted as if nothing had happened, even though the memory of that afternoon still stung every time she thought about it. The boss had eventually found a pianist. A young man from a local music school who agreed to play for a reduced fee in exchange for exposure and networking opportunities. The office buzzed with excitement as the gala approached. People talked about their outfits and their dates and how fancy the hotel was going to be. Renee listened quietly and said nothing. She had decided not to attend. It wasn't required for someone at her level. And honestly, she didn't see the point. Why would she want to stand in the corner of a ballroom, watching everyone else celebrate, while a stranger played the instrument she had once loved more than anything in the world? But on the morning of the gala, her supervisor stopped by her desk with an apologetic smile. "Hey, I know this is last minute," she said, "but we're short on staff for tonight. We need a few extra hands to help with check-in and coat storage. Would you be able to come? Just for a couple of hours. You'd be doing me a huge favor." Renee wanted to say no. Every part of her wanted to say no. But she had never been good at refusing requests. She was the person who always said yes. Always helped out. Always put others before herself, so she agreed. That evening, she put on the only formal dress she owned. It was simple and black, with long sleeves and a modest neckline. She had bought it years ago for her grandmother's funeral and hadn't worn it since. It still fit. Though it felt strange to see herself dressed up after so long, she took a taxi to the Grand Lakeview Hotel. Even from outside, she could tell this was going to be something special. The building was lit up with golden lights, and a red carpet led from the entrance to the grand doors. Luxury cars pulled up one after another, dropping off guests in elegant gowns and tailored suits. Renee slipped in through a side entrance, the one reserved for staff. She found her supervisor and got her assignment. She would be helping at the coat check station near the main ballroom. It was a simple job. Take the coats, hand out tickets, smile politely. Easy enough. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Guests arrived in waves, laughing and greeting each other like old friends. Renee worked quietly, hanging coats and organizing them by number. She could hear the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses coming from the ballroom, and underneath it all, she could hear music. The young pianist had started playing. She recognized the piece immediately. It was a simple classical arrangement, pleasant, but unremarkable. The kind of background music that filled space without demanding attention. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. It was fine. Competent. But it didn't have soul. She pushed the thought away. It wasn't her place to judge. She was here to hang coats, not critique performances. Around 8 o'clock, something changed. Renee noticed a commotion near the ballroom entrance. Staff members were rushing back and forth, whispering urgently. A manager she didn't recognize hurried past with a phone pressed to his ear, his face tight with stress. Then she heard the boss's voice, loud, angry, echoing down the hallway. "What do you mean he left? The event just started. We have 3 more hours of this." Renee's heart skipped. She stepped away from the coat check station and moved closer to the hallway, trying to hear what was happening. A young staff member was trying to explain. "Sir," he said, "it was an emergency. A family thing. He just grabbed his jacket and ran out. He said he was really sorry, but he couldn't stay." The boss's face was red. The vein on his forehead was visible even from a distance. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't play the piano. We have 300 people in that ballroom, including our biggest clients, and now we have a giant piano sitting there, with nobody to play it." He spun around, looking at the staff members who had gathered nearby. "Does anyone have a solution? Anyone? Can we call someone? Another pianist? A DJ? Anything?" One of the managers shook his head. "It's Saturday night, sir. Everyone's booked. We've already tried calling around." The boss let out a string of frustrated words under his breath. He paced back and forth, running his hand through his gray hair. For the first time since Renee had known him, he looked completely out of control. The ballroom had gone quiet. The background music had stopped. Guests were starting to notice. A few were glancing toward the piano, confused. Others were checking their watches. The elegant atmosphere that had taken weeks to plan was starting to unravel. Renee stood frozen in the hallway, watching it all unfold. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. This was none of her business. She was just the coat check girl tonight. She should go back to her station and pretend she hadn't seen anything, but she couldn't move. She kept staring at the entrance to the ballroom. Through the open doors, she could see the piano. It was beautiful. A full grand piano, polished and gleaming under the chandeliers. It sat in the center of the room like a throne, waiting for someone to bring it to life. Her fingers tingled. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years. That familiar pull, that magnetic force that used to draw her to the keys whenever she was near an instrument. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind again. "You have a gift. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that. You. And then another voice. The boss's voice. Cold and mocking. She probably learned Twinkle Twinkle Little Star at summer camp. Something inside Renee snapped. Not in an angry way. In a quiet way. Like a lock finally clicking open after being stuck for years. She didn't make a conscious decision. Her body just started moving. One step, then another. She walked past the staff members, past the managers, past the boss himself. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even seemed to notice her. She walked through the ballroom doors. The room was massive. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across hundreds of guests in their finest attire. Tables were draped in white linen, decorated with flowers and candles. Waiters moved silently between the crowds, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. And in the center of it all, the piano waited. Renee walked toward it. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor. A few guests glanced at her curiously, probably wondering who this woman in the simple black dress was and where she was going. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the piano. When she reached it, she paused. She ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the instrument, feeling the smooth wood beneath her touch. It had been so long, so many years since she had sat at a bench like this, in front of an instrument like this, with an audience waiting. She pulled out the bench and sat down. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted them to the keys. For a moment, she just hovered there, not playing, not moving, barely breathing. The room had grown quiet. People were watching now, whispering, wondering what was happening. Renee closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother, the lessons in the living room, the competitions, the concerts, the standing ovations, the dreams they had shared together. She thought about everything she had lost, everything she had given up, everything she had buried. And then she thought about the boss, the laughter, the humiliation, the way he had dismissed her like she was nothing. Her fingers found the keys, and she began to play. The first note rang out across the ballroom like a whisper. Soft, gentle, almost hesitant. It hung in the air for just a moment before fading into silence. Then came the second note, and the third. And slowly, like a river beginning to flow, the music started to build. Renee had chosen Chopin. It was one of his most beautiful and most difficult pieces, a ballade that she had learned when she was just 15 years old. Back then, her grandmother had sat beside her on the bench, guiding her through every phrase, every pause, every breath. The music needed to take. She hadn't played it in over a decade. But somehow, her fingers remembered. At first, the guests didn't know what to make of it. A few of them stopped their conversations and turned toward the piano. Others kept talking, assuming it was just the background music resuming. But within the first minute, something shifted. The talking grew quieter. The clinking of glasses slowed. One by one, heads began to turn, because this wasn't background music. This was something else entirely. The melody poured out of the piano like water breaking through a dam. It was delicate at first, almost fragile, like the first light of morning. But then it began to swell. The notes grew richer, deeper, more powerful. They filled the ballroom from floor to ceiling, wrapping around every person in the room like an embrace. Renee played with her eyes closed. She wasn't thinking about the audience. She wasn't thinking about the boss, or the humiliation, or the years of silence. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back in her grandmother's living room, sitting at the old upright piano, playing for the only person who had ever truly believed in her. Her fingers danced across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible. The music shifted and changed, moving through moments of quiet tenderness and sudden bursts of passion. It told a story without words, a story of love and loss, of dreams and sacrifices, of pain and, finally, of hope. In the crowd, people had stopped moving altogether. Waiters stood frozen with their trays in midair. Guests who had been chatting just moments ago now stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the woman at the piano. Some of them had tears streaming down their faces without even realizing it. An elderly woman near the front of the room pressed her hand to her chest. She had attended countless concerts in her lifetime, heard some of the greatest pianists in the world, but there was something about this performance that touched her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just technical skill. It was raw, unfiltered emotion. It was truth. A young couple standing near the bar had been in the middle of an argument before the music started. Now they stood side by side, their fight forgotten, their hands slowly finding each other as the melody wrapped around them. A businessman who had come to the gala purely for networking purposes found himself unable to think about deals or contracts. He just stood there, listening, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He thought about his daughter, who had wanted to study music before he had convinced her to pursue something more practical. He made a mental note to call her in the morning. And then there was the boss. He had followed Renee into the ballroom, ready to stop her, ready to pull her away from the piano before she embarrassed herself and the company. But the moment the music started, he froze. His feet wouldn't move. His voice wouldn't work. He just stood there near the entrance, his mouth slightly open, watching the woman he had dismissed and mocked just 3 weeks ago. At first, he thought it must be some kind of trick. Maybe she had practiced one piece really well. Maybe she had gotten lucky. But as the music continued, as the complexity and beauty of the performance became undeniable, reality began to sink in. She wasn't fumbling. She wasn't struggling. She was playing like a master. No, not just a master. She was playing like someone who had been born for this. Someone whose soul was connected to the instrument in a way that most people could never understand. His face changed as the minutes passed. The anger faded first, replaced by confusion. Then the confusion gave way to something else. Something uncomfortable. It was the slow, dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had judged someone without knowing anything about them, that he had laughed at a person who possessed more talent in her fingertips than he would ever have in his entire body. The music reached its climax. Renee's hands flew across the keys with breathtaking speed, building toward a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the ballroom. The chandeliers above seemed to tremble, the air itself felt electric, and then, just as suddenly as it had built, the music began to soften. The storm passed, and what remained was gentle and quiet and heartbreakingly beautiful. The final notes floated through the room like leaves falling in autumn, each one landing softly before fading into silence. Renee played the last chord and let it ring. She held her hands over the keys for a moment, her eyes still closed, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The room was absolutely still, 300 people, and not a single sound. Then she opened her eyes. For a moment, she seemed almost surprised to find herself there. Surprised by the grand piano, the chandeliers, the hundreds of faces staring at her. It was as if she had just woken up from a dream, and then the applause began. It started with one person, a woman near the front who brought her hands together slowly, almost reverently. Then another person joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom had erupted into applause, not polite, restrained clapping. This was something else. This was thunderous, overwhelming, standing ovation applause. People rose from their seats. They cheered. They wiped tears from their eyes. Some of them called out "Brava" and "Encore." Others simply stood in stunned silence, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Renee sat at the piano bench, completely overwhelmed. She didn't know what to do. She had spent so many years hiding, so many years convincing herself that this part of her life was over. And now, here she was, surrounded by hundreds of strangers who were looking at her like she had just given them something precious. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking slightly beneath her. She gave a small, awkward bow. Not sure of the proper etiquette after so many years away from the stage. The applause only grew louder. A woman approached her. Then another. People wanted to shake her hand, to thank her, to ask her name. Where had she trained? Where had she been performing? Why had they never heard of her? Renee answered as best she could, though her voice felt strange and distant, like it belonged to someone else. She kept looking around the room, half expecting to wake up and find herself back at her desk, sorting through expense reports. But this was real. All of it was real. From across the ballroom, the boss watched. He hadn't moved from his spot near the entrance. He hadn't joined the standing ovation. He just stood there, his arms hanging at his sides, his face pale. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, he had nothing to say. The crowd eventually began to settle. People returned to their conversations, their drinks, their networking. But the energy in the room had changed. There was a warmth now, a connection that hadn't been there before, and everyone kept glancing at the piano, at the woman who had appeared out of nowhere and reminded them all of what real talent looked like. Renee stepped away from the crowd and found a quiet corner near the windows. She needed a moment to breathe, to collect herself, to understand what had just happened. She looked out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. She barely recognized herself. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt alive. Renee was still standing by the window when she felt someone approach. She turned, expecting another guest, wanting to shake her hand or ask questions. But it wasn't a guest. It was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind a pair of round glasses. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he was someone important. But more than that, There was warmth in his expression. Genuine warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice calm and respectful. "I just had to come speak with you." Renee shook her head. "No, not at all. I was just catching my breath." The man smiled. "I can imagine. That was quite a performance." He extended his hand. "My name is Victor. Victor Castellano. I'm a music producer. I work primarily with classical artists, concert pianists, orchestras. I've spent the last 40 years discovering and nurturing talent." Renee shook his hand, her mind struggling to keep up. "A music producer. Here. Talking to her. I have to be honest with you," Victor continued. "I almost didn't come tonight. These corporate events aren't really my scene. I only agreed because a friend of mine is on the board here, and he insisted I make an appearance." He paused, his eyes studying her face. "Now I understand why." Renee didn't know what to say. She just stood there, waiting. "What you did up there," Victor said slowly, "that wasn't just playing piano. That was storytelling. That was emotion made audible. I've heard hundreds of pianists over the years. Technically perfect, classically trained, flawless in every way, but most of them are missing something. They play the notes, but they don't feel them." He pointed gently at Renee's chest. "You feel them. That's rare. That's a gift." Renee's eyes began to sting. She blinked quickly, trying to hold herself together. Victor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small business card. "I'm putting together a tour for next year. A series of concerts across Europe and Asia. I've been searching for the right pianist to headline it. Someone who can connect with audiences on a deep level. Someone who can make people feel something real." He held out the card. "I'd like that someone to be you." Renee stared at the card like it might disappear if she touched it. I don't know what to say. I haven't performed professionally in over 10 years. I gave it up. I thought that part of my life was over." Victor nodded slowly. "I understand. Life takes us in unexpected directions. But talent like yours doesn't just vanish. It waits. And when the time is right, it comes back." He pressed the card gently into her hand. "Think about it. Call me when you're ready. No pressure. No rush. But please, don't let this gift go to waste again." He gave her one last smile, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. Renee looked down at the card in her hand. It was simple, elegant, with just a name, a phone number, and the logo of a well-known classical music label. Her hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else entirely. She slipped the card into her pocket and took a deep breath. The night wasn't over yet. A few minutes later, the boss appeared. He walked toward her slowly, his usual confidence noticeably absent. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his eyes kept darting around the room, as if he was worried about who might be watching. When he finally stopped in front of her, he didn't speak right away. He just stood there, looking uncomfortable in a way Renee had never seen before. He started, then stopped. He cleared his throat and tried again. "That was incredible. I had no idea you could play like that." Renee looked at him calmly. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't feel small or humiliated. She just felt tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of hiding. Tired of shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. "You didn't ask," she said quietly. "You assumed you knew everything about me. But you never actually asked." The boss opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, he didn't have a clever comeback or a dismissive joke. He just stood there, exposed. "I tried to tell you," Renee continued, "in that meeting. I raised my hand and offered to help, but you laughed at me. You made everyone else laugh at me. You called me sweetheart and compared me to someone playing nursery rhymes at summer camp." He winced at the reminder of his own words. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Renee said. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand something. There are people all around you, every single day, who have talents and stories and dreams that you know nothing about. And if you keep dismissing people based on their job titles or how quiet they are, you're going to miss out on a lot." The boss nodded slowly. He looked older somehow, standing there under the chandeliers. The arrogance that usually surrounded him like armor had cracked, and underneath it, he just looked like a man who had made a mistake and didn't know how to fix it. "You're right," he said finally. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Renee studied his face. She could tell he meant it. Maybe not completely, maybe not deeply, but enough. It was more than she had expected from him. "Thank you," she said simply. And then, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. The rest of the night passed in a blur. More people approached her. More compliments. More questions. More business cards pressed into her palm. By the time the gala ended, Renee felt like she had lived an entire lifetime in a single evening. When she finally got home, she kicked off her heels and sat down on the edge of her bed. The apartment was quiet. The photograph of her grandmother sat on the nightstand, exactly where it always was. Renee picked it up and held it gently. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I finally did it." She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in response. Warm, proud, full of love. "I always knew you would, sweetheart. I always knew." The next morning, Renee walked into the office and went straight to her supervisor's desk. She handed in her resignation letter with a calm, steady hand. "I'm leaving," she said. "I appreciate everything, but it's time for me to move on." Her supervisor looked surprised but didn't argue. Word of the previous night's performance had already spread through the office like wildfire. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew who Renee really was. As she packed up her desk, co-workers stopped by one. Some of them apologized for never taking the time to get to know her. Others simply wished her luck. A few asked for her autograph, half joking but half serious. Renee smiled and thanked them all. She didn't hold any grudges. Life was too short for that. She took one last look around the office, at the desk where she had spent 3 invisible years, at the window that overlooked the parking lot, at the world she was leaving behind. Then she picked up the photograph of her grandmother, tucked it carefully into her bag, and walked out the door. 3 months later, Renee stood backstage at a concert hall in Vienna. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled. The audience was waiting, buzzing with anticipation. She was dressed in a beautiful gown, her hair styled elegantly, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and excitement. But it was a good kind of pounding. The kind that reminded her she was alive. A stagehand approached her. 2 minutes, miss." Renee nodded. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about the little girl who had first touched piano keys in her grandmother's living room. She thought about the teenager who had dreamed of stages, just like this one. She thought about the woman who had hidden herself away for so long, convinced that her story was already over. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The lights dimmed. The crowd fell silent. And somewhere in that audience, in a seat he had quietly purchased without telling anyone, sat the boss. He had come not to network or impress anyone, but simply to watch. To witness the talent he had once dismissed with a laugh. Renee walked onto the stage. The spotlight found her. The grand piano gleamed under the lights. She sat down, placed her fingers on the keys, and smiled. Then she began to play.